Hello and welcome to the Sky News Daily Podcast with me, Rob Powell, in Westminster today. On the day that politics really came roaring back after a sleepy summer, we've had the concrete crisis, the Labour reshuffle, potentially another by-election, and of course, a new show here on Sky News Politics Hub. That's hosted by Sophy Ridge, who's with me now.
Hi, Rob. Good to see you.
Very weird to be on this side asking you questions.
Yeah, I know. It's weird. I kind of feel I feel it's a bit weird too. I'm much more comfortable on the other side. It's quite hard on this side. I feel like you've got to know more. But anyway, yes, I mean, we're back with a bang, aren't we? It has been a breathtaking day already. And I think it just really shows why it's an exciting time to be launching a new daily political show. I've obviously been doing the Sunday show, which has been an absolute privilege for the last 6 years, but I'm quite looking forward to getting stuck into the kind of daily drumbeat of Westminster. And today is really showing why, because we've got Labour reshuffle, we've got crumbling Britain after what some would argue decades of underinvestment in schools, hospitals, etc., and by-elections on the horizon. I mean, Rob, it's. I mean, you've just come back after the summer recess as well. It's talk about needing to get the coffee in.
Yeah, so let's start with the Labour reshuffle. It's sort of a bit like transfer deadline day for people in Westminster, isn't it? As you kind of keep an eye on who's going where. Essentially, Lisa Nandy being demoted from the Levelling Up brief, Angela Rayner kind of shuffled sideways. There's been a lot of briefing against Lisa Nandy recently. She's had a kind of rough ride in a lot of the papers. And I always felt it maybe a little bit weird because, you know, her interests as a politician around towns, communities, things like that seem to align pretty well with her brief that she's just been shunted out of. What do you think's going on there?
Yeah, it is a bit odd, particularly because she's one of their, I would say, strongest media performers as well. And she speaks to a certain supporter in the Labour Party who's very important for them as well. I think what this shows is that Keir Starmer is all-powerful. There was a time when Lisa Nandy would have been a risk. Irritating Lisa Nandy, getting on the wrong side of her, with the backing she had in the party, would be risky for Keir Starmer. And that time is gone. He can do what he wants now because he's so far ahead in the polls. And the fact that she's accepted what is clearly a demotion, I mean, she's now effectively underneath the Shadow Foreign Secretary, which is the job she used to have. She's accepted it, I think, just shows, I guess, the authority that Keir Starmer is enjoying right now in his party.
And how much of this do you think is about giving Angela Rayner something a bit more specific? She'll now be shadowing Michael Gove. She'll be talking about housing, things like cladding, big, quite emotive topics like that. And now she can talk about that as well. Do you think that's partly what's going on?
Yeah, I do. Definitely. Yeah, it was weird before. She had about a million different jobs and yet no one was really sure exactly what any of them were. And I think what this shows is the improving relationship between Angela Rayner and Keir Starmer. He actually wants to get more of Angela Rayner out there. He obviously thinks she's an asset to the party. And I guess, you know, if you're talking about keeping the left happy, then Angela Rayner can do that as well as Lisa Nandy. Maybe they feel she's a bit more loyal.
I guess Labour reshuffle, sometimes you wonder how much of it is a bit of a bubble story in terms of Westminster bubble. But I guess what changes that is we're probably a year, a bit more away from a general election. With Labour so far ahead in the polls, you can realistically look at the people being put into these briefs and think these are the people that could be running transport and housing communities this time in 14 months. What do you think Sir Keir Starmer's instructing them to do for the months ahead? Because we get a lot of Labour guests on your show. I'm sure you'll get them on the nightly show as well. And whilst they're very quick to pick apart and criticise what the Tories are doing, it's sometimes so hard just to get anything solid in policy terms out of them. And do you think this is the moment where Keir Starmer says, look, OK, you can go for it a little bit more?
No, to be honest.
How depressing.
I don't think it will. I don't think it will. And the reason is because they have bound themselves so closely to effectively what the Conservatives are doing in terms of spending. And you've seen that with interviews with Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer recently, where they're saying, no, we're not going to put up income tax. No, there's not going to be any wealth taxes. No, we're not going to increase borrowing. And so actually, if you're thinking about big punchy policies, they will say it's about reform. It's not all about spending money, which, look, is true to a point. But if you want to do something really transformative, I would question how much you can do if you're not willing to spend a bit more money. And so I think that straitjacket and that, I guess they would call it fiscal discipline.
And I guess that straitjacket is so sort of firmly visible now that anyone being moved into these briefs will have to just be completely accepting of it.
Yeah, the authority is there.
Should we talk about the government and the Tories a little bit?
Yes.
First of all, we've had a couple of results that have come back from various appeals and bullying grievances and things like that this morning. Sir Gavin Williamson being found to have bullied by the independent expert panel the former chief whip. He's apparently going to apologise for that. We've also got Chris Pincher's appeal that has been lost as well, potentially the more interesting one, because I guess that might mean if he doesn't choose to resign, he might face a recall petition and there could be another by-election, which means sort of October, November is shaping up for maybe one in his seat in Tamworth, potentially mid-Bedfordshire, as Nadine Dorries has finally resigned as well. Given conference is supposed to have been seen as the sort of big moment where Rishi Sunak sets out who he is, how much potential is there for that sort of reset to be spoiled by almost the hangover of what's been going on through these various cases?
Well, there's a lot of potential, isn't there? My gut, I don't know what you think, Rob. My gut is that Nadine Dorries, that seat, they might hang on to.
Yeah, I was up there in a classic kind of summer recess journalistic endeavour, driving around the towns of mid-Bedfordshire about 3 weeks ago, asking people if they'd seen.
Yeah, what was your take? Do you reckon that it's going to stay Conservative?
So, talking to one of the independent councillors around there, they said that they felt that the Lib Dems were overly confident about taking it because all the polling showed actually Labour were rivalling with the rivals.
It's a bit of a split vote, isn't it? Maybe.
But I'm not really sure whether Labour would. It doesn't feel right for Labour in mid-Bedfordshire. And I think a lot of the people we spoke to, they interestingly said in the past, actually, Nadine Dorries, they felt had been a bit more present.
Yeah.
And weren't necessarily, there's a lot of anger there, but it felt like maybe a bit more of a one-off rather than something that was spoiling the Tory brand more broadly. Yeah. So I think you're right, they might hang on to it, but it might be a bit bumpy.
Chris Pincher, I think that seat is looking a bit dicey. I mean, look, it's the circumstances in which he's forced to go is very difficult for the Conservatives. He's got pretty healthy majority. But also I was kind of reading to say that they've got a bit of an issue because that seat is going to change. And so what do? Do they get, I think it's going to be merged with a neighbouring seat, Eddie Hughes' seat. What do? Do they get Eddie Hughes to stand in Chris Pincher's constituency, which is going to be the constituency going forward, and then have another by-election that they will probably lose? Or do they say, OK, let's have a candidate who's only going to be here for like a year and a half and then it's probably going to be someone else? It's actually a bit difficult for them.
Yeah. The other one that's really interesting as well, I guess, going back to Labour, is the one that will be happening in Scotland for Margaret Ferrier's seat. Because for all the talk of, I guess, the Tory by-elections ruining conference for Rishi Sunak, if Labour doesn't take that, then there'll be big questions about whether they'll be able to perform in Scotland to the level that they need to try and get into government.
Yeah, and we really are starting to see the answers to all these questions that we keep posing on exactly, is Labour going to make the breakthrough that they need? I think they've never won a majority with less than 40 seats in Scotland or something like that since, ages ago. So they're going to need to take seats in Scotland.
That could be the most crucial one then out of them all. OK, let's move on to talk about so-called concrete crisis. And we've had a bit of an eye-catching intervention. Gillian Keegan, the Education Secretary, caught what she thought was off camera, but the camera was still rolling after an interview she did with ITV earlier today. And this is how she characterised her own efforts on this and the efforts of people around her. Have a listen.
But we will get a plan and every single one of them will be done.
OK, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Does anyone ever say, you know what, you've done a good job because everyone else has sat on their and done nothing? No signs of that, no?
So, Sophie, I don't know, I kind of think almost when will ministers learn? We've been through this so many times with hot mics and unguarded comments and things like that. But given there's a lot of pupils and teachers that are quite upset that they only got 4 days' notice of some of these closures and park closures, crowing about how you think you've done a good job doesn't strike me as ideal for the Education Secretary.
It's a really bad look, isn't it? Saying that you've done a good job in the circumstances. Even if she feels that, for, like you say, the parents who've just coming back off the summer holiday to be worried about whether their kids are safe in the classroom, there's confusion about the numbers of schools affected when they knew. It's a mess. It's a big mess, let's be honest. And I've got a lot of questions. The Education Secretary, Gillian Keegan, due to come on the programme at 7:30 this evening. My main question, I guess, is who is the everyone else she's talking about? Is she talking about former Conservative education secretaries? I mean, they've been in power since 2010.
Is there any way that this comes off good for her? As in, does she look like a sort of plain speaking, she apologises for it and says, sorry about my choice of language? Is there any way that this comes off well for her? Because I'm thinking back to the Ken Clarke unguarded comment when she described when he described Theresa May as a be difficult woman, to censor myself there. And actually, for Theresa May, that at the time was seen as, oh my God, she's been criticised by Ken Clarke. But it was almost high praise.
Yeah,
is there
she
any
owned
way
it,
that
didn't she?
Gillian Keegan can turn this to sort of say, well, look, I'm a plain speaking person. I'm different from.
Yeah, look, the sceptic in me is wondering, and I'd be interested to know your take on this, Rob. Do you think she knew? I mean, there was a camera pointing in her face.
And it was seconds after they'd finished the formal interview. I think they were doing setup shots.
Yeah.
So you must know.
I just wonder.
I'm not sure. Maybe I'm being a bit too, Kremlinology or whatever it is about this and reading too much into it.
I just wonder.
Maybe, though,
I'll ask her.
This is you ask. I guess this is embarrassing, but do you think that the broader political danger, though, for the government is that if we keep getting more news of schools that have this type of concrete in and more closures, other public buildings, the Labour attack of this is 13 years of Tory rule and our schools are crumbling, do you think that is more dangerous than this, which could prove to be sort of embarrassing but a bit more short term?
Of course, definitely. The main story here is the schools crumbling. It's question marks about investment in infrastructure, not just schools, hospitals, roads, rails, things that are creaking at the seams, and looking at that capital spending since 2010 and what is going on there. That is the big political story here. But this just keeps the story going. And anything that does that is bad news for the government.
Okay. Thanks, Sophie. Good luck with the show.
Thanks.
Remind us when it's on.
7 p.m. tonight, and Gillian Keegan, well, we haven't been told anything else, due to be interviewed at 7:30.
Well, we lie in wait. Okay, thank you, Sophie. And we'll be talking more about lightweight concrete with the building surveyor after this. Well, it's the first day of a new term for MPs in Parliament here in Westminster. But of course, it's also the first day of term for school pupils, but not for all of them. After more than 100 schools were either fully or partially shut at the end of last week because of concerns over a type of lightweight concrete used extensively in the years after the Second World War. Earlier, we asked the Prime Minister about the school closures. The former Permanent Secretary at the Department for Education has said this morning that when they wanted to put more money into repairing schools, you as Chancellor didn't allow that to go ahead and in fact cut that budget. Are you to blame for what's happening now? And do you want to apologise to parents and pupils?
I think that is completely and utterly wrong. Actually, one of the first things I did as Chancellor in my first spending review in 2020 was to announce a new 10-year school rebuilding programme for 500 schools. Now that equates to about 50 schools a year that will be refurbished or rebuilt. And if you look at what we've been doing over the previous decade, that's completely in line with what we've always done.
That was Rishi Sunak speaking earlier. We can now bring in Adrian Tagg, who's Associate Professor and Lead for Building Surveying at the University of Reading. I wanted to start off by really asking you, can you give us a sort of potted history of this RAAC concrete?
There was a widespread use of concrete really post-Second World War. It's seen as a conceptual material, very much seen as the answer to a materials crisis following the end of the Second World War. And in particular, RAAC concrete is a lightweight, prefabricated, quick fix solution as a low cost solution, and really used typically from that 1950s through to perhaps the 1990s. Used very much in panels for low story, single story buildings, low rise buildings, typically for roof panels, and not just in the UK. I've worked significantly in Europe as well.
So when did people start to become more alarmed about this type of concrete and what it could mean in terms of collapses? Because I guess this has been sort of thrust right to the front of public attention in the last few days. But when you look back, you can sort of trace back certain examples of things going wrong and concerns being flagged years in some cases.
We've had concerns about this material as what's called a deleterious material for a number of years. It's been publicised, it's been written in professional journals. If I would say for in the region of 10 years or more, but we've come across in the line of our inspection elements of this decaying. I've seen it in the early 2000s, so nearly 20 years ago, I suppose. There's been catalogued some roof collapse and stuff involving the material, but we've known about its properties as being this sort of lightweight, low cost material, and although it's normally fine in situ, the risk is if the material is exposed to the elements and gets wet, so it's a very lightweight, it's very porous, there's lots of air bubbles in the concrete that absorbs moisture, increases the weight of the material, makes it prone to deflection. And of course, any moisture getting inside a concrete that's reinforced with steel is going to cause the steel to corrode process known carbonation, which can cause a rapid onset of failure and collapse. It's not an easy solution or an easy fix to resolve it. People talk about re-roofing these buildings, which would come at a significant cost and disruption. But in many ways, you're looking at quite old construction technology, maybe a building from the 70s. Why would you re-roof a building from the 70s when it makes a sort of cost-benefit exercise to rebuild the whole thing new, get better energy efficiency, rather than just addressing the roof? So there's lots more questions and answers at the moment, I would say.
So if you were talking about public sector buildings, you'd potentially be looking at it making more sense just to rebuild rather than to try and take the roof off and put another one on and make it good.
I think so. We're caught in a real tricky situation. We've got this kind of drive, for net zero 2050 more energy efficient buildings. Certainly buildings of the 50s through to the 70s and even the 80s were not designed to be intrinsically energy efficient. So it seems sort of an unusual commercial decision to just change the roof when perhaps the external walls need insulating or there's more work to be involved, and in which case the cost benefit may be to just simply replace the building with new. Aim for that 50-year plus life cycle of a new building. Something like that might make more commercial sense or more sense to the public finances. But of course, what we seem to forget is the enormous disruption this causes, particularly to school children and the occupants of buildings. You can't just close schools down forever, or certainly for a long period of time while these works are being executed.
And does this interact with issues around asbestos as well? We know obviously another material more widely used where obviously grave concerns came to light further down the line. There was some reporting over the weekend about the risks of essentially trying to replace and repair concrete roofs and the risk of that almost flaring up asbestos that was there as well. How do the two interact, and how much of a risk does asbestos pose, or how much more complexity does it add into the situation?
Asbestos has been in use for longer than the RAAC blanks, but asbestos certainly saw an explosion in its use post World War II again, but it was used more for domestic application, so not just in building materials. It was used in insulating pipework. It was used for rainwater pipes. It was used for domestic appliances in the kitchen and stuff like that. And thankfully, that has now pretty much been eradicated. So how we manage asbestos at the moment is we manage it in situ. We try and remove it. We make it asbestos free, if you like, or we make it asbestos safe in a situation where it's managed in situ. But the danger with, of course, a 1950s or 60s or 70s building is if there is asbestos inside that roof void, if there's asbestos in the insulation, so perhaps above or below the concrete planks. Once you start disturbing that, then you've got another major issue. And the cost of asbestos removal is extremely high. It comes at a significant risk. So while I wouldn't sort of downplay the potential for asbestos to be present in these ages of buildings, let's not forget that we've had in place legislation and means of managing asbestos fairly successfully since really the end of the 20th century.
And I guess to sort of look at another recent example in the area, if we look at cladding and what happened with Grenfell, can you make any comparisons? Because there seems to be a sort of equivalent of material that was used and then found to be unsafe. Are there comparisons there, or is it a bit different?
Well, it's different in the terms of the properties and the problem and the if you like the cause of the defect. But what I will say is the construction sector is kind of littered with conceptual materials and ideas that sort of realised to be a failure with time. You talk about concrete as being this amazing material post Second World War, and it still is a brilliant material, provided it's looked after and protected from the rain and pollution. And to an extent, we went through this sort of 1960s, 70s concrete tower buildings, residential towers, poor energy efficiency, cold bridging, dampness, condensation, all the things you'd expect with that. And the way around that was to clad them externally, insulate and clad them externally, improve their aesthetic. But of course, by introducing this aluminium composite panels, we created a fire risk. So, it seems that we always seem to learn through mistakes with building and construction. And although it would be sort of almost foolish to draw a comparison between the defect caused by cladding and these roofing panels, I think the notion that we learn by our mistakes, regrettably, is something that's common in the construction sector. Ultimately, if you wind the clock back and look at the UK housing stock, there's a reason why, to an extent, that there's so many pre-1920s Victorian properties around, and they're simply made of very good quality materials. Okay, they've got their failings and their problems in energy and efficiency, but as a product, if you like, they're very, very good. And we've tried to go higher, quicker, lighter, faster, cheaper, and that's come back to haunt us.
Well, that's it for the Daily for today. Don't forget, Politics Hub with Sophy Ridge starts tonight at 7 p.m. It's on Monday to Thursday, so don't forget to tune in. But for now, bye-bye.